Atkinson is really nice.
She's nice and funny.
The thing I like most about Miss Atkinson is she's very respectful to us, and when someone isn't like in the best mood, she's like really calm and handles it very well.
I like the way she teaches. I like the way that she teaches. I like the teacher because she's nice to me. My favorite thing about my teacher is she's nice. My favorite thing about my teacher is that she's nice and she is very nice because she likes me. My favorite thing about my teacher is she's very
My favorite thing about Mr. Briggs is how funny he is.
What I like about Mr. Briggs is that he makes up stories and that he's funny.
My favorite thing about Mr. Briggs is that he acts out of things.
I like how Mr. Briggs does a lot of experiments. What I like most about Mr. Briggs is when he does the sentence family.
My favorite thing about Mrs. McIntosh is she has a very creative personality and she's very funny and nice.
My favorite thing about Miss McIntosh is all the funny voices she makes.
Favorite thing about Miss McIntosh is she just dances around the classroom sometimes.
My favorite thing about Mrs. McIntosh is her creativity, and she's so funny and she laughs a lot.
My favorite thing about Miss O'Neill is she's funny.
My favorite thing about Miss O'Neill is she's very fun and kind.
She's nice and she's funny.
My favorite thing about the music teacher is that she goes through a lot of trouble just to make one play.
My favorite thing about my music teacher is that she lets us hold parts of instruments.
My favorite thing about our classroom assistant is that she helps us with our work.
My favorite thing about the classroom assistant is that they're nice.
She does a lot of good stuff for us. She lets us read a lot. If Miss Shelton ever catches us like sad or left out, she always gets somebody, or she does it herself. She always makes sure that they're included in something. I like Miss Shelton because she's young and she's enthusiastic and she's always nice. And she's never just like old and crabby. She always has good activities.
She's very nice and she respects us.
She's very fun with us, and like she does like science experiments that are fun.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Bassett is that we have great math lessons. Favorite thing is about Mrs. Bassett that she does math and reading with us. I like when Mrs. Bassett reads funny stories.
I like how they keep the lunchroom going when they tell us to go outside.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Darian is that when we get hurt, she helps us. Mrs. Darian, I like you because you're very sweet. My favorite thing about Mrs. Deutscher's class is about AR testing. My favorite thing about Mrs. Deutscher is all the fun activities we do with her. Favorite thing about Mrs. Deutscher is that we have inside recess. All the crafts that we make in class.
My favorite thing with Mrs. Dorr is so fun.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Thor is that we do math together.
She's nice. I like that my teacher, when we're behind, she tells us that we need to keep working.
My favorite thing about the art teacher is she lets us talk and do fun things and lets us have a free art date.
Favorite thing about my art teacher is we always get to do crafts.
She's creative and she always thinks of fun stuff for us to do in class.
I like her sense of energy and how she teaches.
I like how she gives us breaks and we can do run around the room. My favorite thing about Mrs. Downs is that she always thinks of fun things for us to do.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Dan is that she's nice to us and she makes sure that we answer every question on time.
She tells us all the answers on our homework after we're done doing it.
My favorite thing about Miss Han, she is funny.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Hare is that she's nice to us and she's funny.
My favorite thing about the librarian, Miss Lenga, is that she lets, instead of having to try and run around and help all the kids, she lets the kids that she know are like talented at the books and everything help those kids.
My favorite thing about the librarian is that she helps me pick out the books.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Hooley is she's nice and funny.
My favorite thing about Miss Hooley is she plays fun games with us.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Hooley is she helps us when we need help or in trouble.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Hooley is that she says if we work hard, we play hard.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Nash is that she can be strict and sometimes she can be nice and funny.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Nash is that she's always so nice.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Nash is that she works hard to get us all ready for Steph and Irene.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Kaminsky is she helps us learn new things. My favorite thing about Mrs. Kaminsky is that she is not very nice and she lets us play games.
When we raise her hand, she comes to us and helps with our problems.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Lasky is she teaches us math. I like Mrs. Lasky because she is funny.
I like Mrs. Lasky because she's the best teacher in the world. My favorite thing about the custodians is that they can keep the school clean.
Go.
My favorite thing about the custodians is that even when you do drop or make a mistake, they clean it up for you.
Go.
My favorite thing about the custodians is that they clean our school and help our school keep and clean.
That she's nice to us. The thing about Mrs. Towson is that sometimes she lets us have what we want, and sometimes she gives us snacks for movies on the smart board. My favorite thing about Mrs. Miskowitz is that when she does math, she does something fun.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Miskowitz is that after math we do something fun.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Miskowitz is that if we turn in our homework sheets, we get candy.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Younggreen is everything about her.
I like Mrs. Younggreen because she lets me read for a long time.
I like Mrs. Younggreen because she is nice and she reads books to us.
What I like about Mrs. Wilson best is that she helps us with a lot of things, like when we fill people's buckets and how to solve problems.
My favorite thing about the counselor is that she's sweet and kind and she gives good messages, and I really like that she helps people with their problems.
We get to play squash, but sometimes we always we play bingo and we get free suckers.
What I like about Mrs. Talbert is that she is fun and learning.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Talbert is that she's an awesome teacher and she helps us learn. My favorite thing about Mrs. Talbert is that she's unique in her own kind of way.
She is really fun.
I like her teacher because she teaches us great things.
She's sweet and nice.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Vanes is that she reads us lots of books.
My favorite thing about Mrs. Vanes is that she's wonderful, cheerful, and laughful. She lets us do lots of math.
My favorite thing about Miss Vanes is that she lets us read and do math.
My favorite thing about Mrs. West is she teaches me science. My favorite thing about Mrs. West is that she has long hair and that she's funny. My favorite thing about Mrs. West is that we do crafts with her.
My favorite thing about the gym teacher is when she wants you to exercise, she always does it in a fun way.
I like my gym teacher because she teaches us new stuff in gym.
She helped me with doing the work